All right, so we're continuing John. So take your Bible. I'm going to have you turn to two passages tonight. We're going to start off, later we're going to be in John chapter 11. So this is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And we all kind of know that story, right? At least for the most part, we kind of know the idea. Lazarus dies, Jesus brings him back to life. But as usual, in John's gospel, there's a bunch of stuff under the surface that I think we need to pull out, and that's kind of the purpose of what we do here on Wednesday night. Is we go a little bit deeper, try to get behind the text of the culture and the Old Testament stuff and all that. So we'll be in John 11 in a little bit, but if you've got an old-fashioned Bible, turn to Psalm 118. We'll be there in just a minute after I kind of set up what we're going to talk about. So Psalm 118 and John chapter 11. And I'll have the psalm on the screen in case you don't have a Bible with you. But okay, so we finished this part of John, chapters 5 through 10, that were centered around 4 Jewish feasts. And so that part has ended. Those group of stories have ended. And now we get to what we call the hinge section. So you've got all this stuff that was happening leading up to this point where Jesus is doing miracles, he's making a lot of bold claims, and he's getting in trouble, right? Jesus has been in trouble like several times already, over and over and over again with the Jewish leaders. But the common people, for the most part, are believing what Jesus is saying. So there's this tension between believers and people who aren't believing. So all this is building up, this tension between the Jewish leaders and Jesus is building up to chapters 11 and 12, and this is like the hinge in the story because in chapter 12 begins the countdown to Jesus' death. So from chapter 12 to chapter 20 is the Passion Week, so it's the 7-day countdown to his death. What launches that off is the raising of Lazarus, which sounds strange because how is raising a guy from the dead, how does that put a target on your back? But when you're already wanting to kill a guy and then he does something big like that, it just makes it worse. So we kind of call this section here in the middle, which is why I put it in the middle, the hinge between the two sections of the book. Now, the other thing, and there's a ton of stuff in your notes. There's 4,500 words of stuff in your notes, okay? I've kind of put a lot of work into this one. And I'm not going to cover all that tonight, don't worry. But this is depending on how you count the signs in John's Gospels. The miracles are signs. They're called signs. Depending on how you count them, the raising of Lazarus is the 7th sign. Now, you could, if you skipped one, like the walking on water thing, some people don't count that one as a sign. I do. But this would be the 7th sign. And the interesting thing about that is, I don't know if you realize this, I didn't know it till this week because I never really paid attention. But in the Old Testament, there are 4 resurrections. There are four different people who get brought back from the dead. One of them is not a bodily resurrection, but it still functions kind of the same. In the New Testament, you want to guess how many there are? So there's 4 in the Old Testament. You want to guess how many resurrections there are in the New? 3? 3? Why'd you guess 3? Because it equals 7, maybe? Yeah. Lazarus is the 7th person to be raised from the dead in the Bible. So I don't think that's a coincidence. And 7's a big deal, especially in John's Gospel. And there's some other stuff in your notes about the Exodus and how some of that connects. We'll probably cover that more when we get closer to the resurrection, Jesus' resurrection. But I put some of it in your notes there. But here's the thing we need to do. When I was studying John 11, I'm always looking for clues to figure out what Old Testament passages are behind this story, and what is John trying to get us to make connections with. And I saw a couple things, and I remembered this sounds like some things in the Old Testament. So I went digging, and there's a ton of connections between John chapter 11 and Psalm 118. So if you've got a Bible, you can follow along there. We're not going to read the entire psalm because it's kind of long, but I'm going to show you some of the connecting points. And my goal here is not to try to say, look how smart I am and all this stuff I found. My goal is to try to teach you that this is how your Bible works. You're meant to be looking for these little, I call them hidden treasures. So when I read the Bible, it's like treasure hunting. There's always something new to find, right? Right? So this is kind of why I dig into this on Wednesday night for everybody, is because I want you to see that this is how John really wants you to read his gospel. So here we go, Psalm 118. This will sound familiar because a lot of worship songs are written based on this. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever. The word there in Hebrew is hesed. It's the Old Testament equivalent to the New Testament word agape. Okay? His faithful, loyal love is what hesed is. His steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. You can kind of tell how this is a song. Like it would be a song later, let Israel say, and then everybody would echo, his love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, which is the priest, his love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. So there's kind of a theme here. It starts right out of the gate that God has some serious love, right? Okay. In John chapter 11, when we get to it in a minute, it's going to mention 3 different times how much Jesus loved Lazarus. It really stands off the page if you know to look for repetition. You notice that. So that's one connection, but it gets better. Out of my distress, I called on the Lord. That's Yahweh, right? Called on, the Hebrew word behind here is cried out with a loud voice. In John chapter 11, Jesus is going to cry out with a loud voice. And he's going to say, Lazarus, come out, right? Okay. This word distress is also interesting. This will be scary because my handwriting is horrible, but we'll see how it goes. Distress is the word ani in Hebrew. And if you are living in a place of distress, it gets added the word Bet-ani, or Bethany. Anybody want to guess what town Lazarus lives in? Bet-ani, yeah, in Hebrew. So I called to the Lord, and he answered me and set me free. So I was bound up, and he set me loose. Anybody see the connection? Somebody's going to come out of the grave bound up. Okay, you're looking at me like I think you're stretching this, but just keep watching. And there's going to be something that Jesus says about the Lord, about the Father answering him. We'll see that in a little bit. The Lord is on my side; I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song and has become my salvation. Now, let me show you what kind of convinced me we're supposed to be thinking this when we read Lazarus' story. If you were going to say God helps in Hebrew, it looks like this. Just rolling me. What is going on? My computer's doing all kinds of stuff. So in Hebrew, if you were doing the shortened form, it would be El, like Elohim, but the shortened form is El. And helped would be Azar. Now, that may not look familiar to you, but if I did this, you've probably seen that name, Eliezer, in your Bible before. Abraham's servant in Genesis 15, Eliezer. What you may not realize is that in Greek, in the New Testament, El Azar us. Do you see it? So the word helped in Hebrew is Azar. God helps is El Azar, Eliezer. In Greek, that name is Lazarus. So there's all kinds of little language things here that I think John means for us to pick up on this. And if you still think I'm stretching this, just keep watching. I shall not die, but I shall live. And then I will recount the deeds of Yahweh. After Lazarus is raised, later on in chapter 12, we're told that everybody there went on to recount the deeds that they saw. Right? The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. So you get the idea that he's so distressed that he's at the point of death, but it's as if he's resurrected, right? I shall live, and then I'm going to tell some people about it. I thank you that you have answered me. In John chapter 11, this is exactly what Jesus says, direct quote. He looks up and says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. That was another clue that made me think, I'm pretty sure Psalm 118 is supposed to be on the brain here. And then a stone gets mentioned, a stone that's rejected or a stone that's taken away. A stone that the builders have taken away or rejected has become the cornerstone. In John chapter 11, Jesus, the cornerstone, is going to tell them to take a stone away. It's a lot cooler to me than it is to you guys, but I'm just telling you. And by the way, this is the Lord's doing. This is something the Lord is going to do. It's his action. It is marvelous in our eyes. Are people going to be shocked when Lazarus walks out of a tomb and it's going to be marvelous? It's going to be like, oh crap, who is this guy, right? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That should sound familiar to you. In John chapter 12, a bunch of people who witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus are going to be standing at the city gates alongside the road with palm branches, and guess what they're saying? Hosanna, which means God saves. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is the messianic kingly thing that they shout out when Jesus is coming into town. The Lord is God, and he has made his light to shine upon us. Doesn't Jesus claim in John's gospel, I am the light of the world? If anyone follows me, he will walk in the light, he will not stumble in the dark. He's going to say that again in John 11, by the way. And then binding is mentioned. Bind the festal sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar. So you've got binding, but at the beginning of the psalm he was saying, the Lord has set me free from being bound, right? Okay, so now that we've got that in our head, right, are we good? Any questions so far? All right, let's jump into John 11. Now a certain man was ill, Eleazar, Lazarus, of a place of distress, Bethany. All right, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now you're familiar with Mary and Martha, right? You remember the story about them being in the house and Mary's at Jesus' feet and Martha's really mad because she's doing all the cooking and Mary's just, hanging around Jesus, wasting time. Y'all remember that story? Right? Most ladies know that one. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. You know what's interesting about that, verse 2? He's referring to a story as if you know it, but he hasn't told you that story yet. That story is actually going to happen in the very next chapter, in the first few verses, where Jesus is anointed. His feet is anointed, right? So this is kind of a thing that John does. It's in modern language, it's a flash forward. You ever watch a TV show and there's like a flash forward and then sometimes they flash back? And sometimes if a show does that too much, you get confused, right? I'm a big fan of the show Lost, which dates me, I know. But it's a really good show. But they do a lot of that, and it can get confusing. What this tells us, though, is that the fact that John mentions a story he hasn't told yet as if you already know it is because he's expecting that you're going to read this more than once. That's why he's putting it there. He's telling you, you're going to have to read this more than one time to get everything out of it, right? So the sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Now, was that true? Doesn't Lazarus die in this story? Yeah. Apparently, Jesus means something different. It doesn't lead to death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. There's a ton of stuff in your notes about this, but just to shorten it a little bit, glory means like brightness, right? Or brilliance. The idea here is this action is going to happen so people can see who Jesus really is. They're going to see his glory through what he's about to perform. And this is a whole theme through John's gospel. He starts in the prologue in chapter 1. He says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? He tabernacled among us. And we have seen his glory, right? So he sets you up in chapter 1 for this story. So the whole point of this is not really about Lazarus. The whole point of this is about Jesus and people seeing who he really is, and that he would be glorified or elevated as who he really is. Now Jesus loved, there it is again, you're told a second time Jesus loves these people. It's like his love just endures forever. All right. Now Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus. So he loved all these people. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he did the logical thing, which is he stayed 2 days longer where he was. Do you see how John throws that in there and doesn't mention that was a weird thing to do? Right? Okay, so the guy who can heal people, he's healed a guy who was crippled for 38 years. That was in chapter 5. In chapter 9, he healed a guy who was blind from birth, right? He's raised an official's daughter from the dead. So, I mean, or an official's son. I may get that mixed up. So he can do all these miracles, and so they go to the miracle worker and say, hey, that guy, Lazarus, that you're good buddies with, you love him, right? You love him a lot, and you love his sisters. He's sick. What do you expect that the healer, the compassionate, loving healer, would do? He'd get up and go with you. But Jesus says, okay, thanks for letting me know. And he stays 2 days longer, right? That's supposed to be shocking to you if you didn't already know this story. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again, because he's not close to Jerusalem, and the Bethany we're talking about here is 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. And it wasn't the first time, by the way. And are you going to go there again? So the disciples are like, man, this is risky. Like, they almost killed you several times already, and you did your little ninja Jesus trick and snuck out somehow, right? So are we really going to go back there again? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? Which seems like a strange answer to, hey, they're going to kill us if we go back there, Jesus. Well, do you know how time works? There's 12 hours in a day. I just try to put myself in these stories and imagine being like Matthew or one of them sitting there and being like, what does that have to do with anything? Right? We're talking about getting killed here. He says, if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. Remember, the 12 hours here, he's talking about daylight hours. If you walk in the day, you won't stumble because he sees the light of this world. Who's the light of the world? Jesus. And then he also claims that we are the light of the world. That's our mission. Okay, so if you walk in the daytime, okay, if we go back to Judea, we're going to die, Jesus. And Jesus says, well, that's why we're going to go in the daytime. That's not really what he's saying, but he gives them this weird parable kind of thing that they would already know. Yeah, we know if you walk around in the dark, you're going to stumble. What are we talking about right now, Jesus? We're scared we're going to die. What does this have to do with that? After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And by the way, that term is lifted straight out of Daniel chapter 12, which is about the final resurrection. It says, many who will sleep in the dust shall be awakened. That's how the resurrection is described in the Old Testament. The disciples said to him, well, Lord, if he's just sleeping, he'll recover. because they totally missed what he was saying, right? By the way, just time out for a second. The fact that the apostles wrote documents that made themselves look stupid proves they're not making this up. Okay? I've read many religious texts from many different parts of the world. I find new ones all the time from the ancient world, and I read through them, the ones that have been translated anyway. We have thousands of ancient documents that nobody's translated yet. And because I don't know ancient Ugaritic, I can't read the tablets. But the ones that have been translated, I've read a lot of them. And every single one reads like propaganda. They never make themselves look bad, and their God always wins. And everybody who works for that God or serves that God, they always win. Even if it's not historically true, they portray it that way, that we're the good guys, right? The New Testament is very unique in that the authors themselves point out how stupid they are all the time. Right? Right? When we read through the Gospels, all the disciples do stupid stuff. And they make it very clear, we were stupid and confused the whole time until he came out of a grave and walked through a wall while we were in a room scared. And then we spent 40 days doing Old Testament Bible study with him. And then they got confident about their mission. The New Testament makes it very clear the disciples are most of the time really confused. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death. This is the narrator, John, butting into the story. He had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant he was taking rest and sleep, as if you didn't catch that. Then Jesus told them plainly, look, guys, Lazarus is dead. That's what I meant by falling asleep. I'm going to go awaken him. Guys, Old Testament, they should have known what he was saying. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. He died, and it's my fault because I didn't show up in time, and I'm glad for your sake. So this story is not about Lazarus. Now, I'm sure it was an interesting day for Lazarus. I'm not so sure he thought it was a good day. Because he probably was about 5 minutes into his second life on earth and thinking, wait, I got to die again. I had to do that twice, right? So it's really not about him. Apparently, it's about everybody who's going to witness what happens to Lazarus. That's who it's really about. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there. Why? So that you may believe. These are the disciples. They already kind of believe, right? But let us go to him. So Thomas, remember doubting Thomas? He gets a bad rap for that doubting part at the resurrection, which I don't know why people make fun of him for that. You'd have been worse, and I would have too, right? If Jesus walked in here right now and you said, I don't know if that's really him, let me touch the holes in his hand, and then you touch the holes, then you'd probably want a scientific study proving that it wasn't an apparition or something, all that kind of stuff. So Thomas, though, we often forget this part. This is brave Thomas. Thomas the brave, right? Thomas, also called the twin, apparently had a twin brother, said to his fellow disciples, let us go also that we may die with him. Did you know Thomas said that? Thomas is pretty bold, right? So keep that in mind when you read about the resurrection and doubting Thomas, that story shows up. Just keep in mind, Thomas was the only one in the group saying, well, let's go. If he's going to go, because we've been around Jesus long enough to know he's going to do what he wants to do. He's going to go, we need to go with him, and we'll die with him. That's a good friend, right? Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. 4 days, that's important. And Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Here's what John's telling us. Some of these, the many of the Jews that came, are from Jerusalem 2 miles away. They already know who Jesus is. Some of them are probably in the crowd that don't like Jesus. But many of them are already believing in Jesus. We've been told several times. Many of the Jews were already believing in him. Right? Now, this 4 days thing is important because there was an ancient Jewish tradition, much before this time, that taught this, that when a person died, the spirit would linger around the body for 3 days. And then it would move on to, in the Old Testament, it's called Sheol. In the New Testament, it's called Hades. And that's not hell, by the way. Not hell as we think of it. It's just a place where all the dead spirits go in that frame of mind. So it would hang out for 3 days. So now we're kind of getting, if with that stuck in your head, with that tradition stuck in your head, doesn't that kind of tell us why Jesus might have waited so long? Because what he's done here is he's waited until he's been dead 4 days where there's no possibility, no tradition out there that a body could come back to life. He's made sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, that if this guy comes out of a grave, it's because Jesus did it, not because of any ancient tradition, right? So, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. This is the same, it's very similar language that Paul uses to describe the second coming of Christ, where we're called up to meet the Lord in the air. It's the same language. It means to go out and greet the king after his victory and escort him into town. So that whole picture of the second coming is he's coming down and we're called up to meet him as he comes, and we escort and come with him into the new creation. It's a beautiful picture. And this is the same language being used here. So she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Apparently Mary likes to sit around. Right? That's a good joke I thought of just now. Anyway, Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, it's easy to read that and think, well, you're kind of being rude to Jesus. But look at the faith she has. I know that if you had been here, you could have healed him. You should see the faith in her statement, not disrespect. And she's very emotional, right? Her brother's dead. But even now, after 4 days, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. I know that if you ask God something, he will listen to you. Even now. So you see the faith in what she's saying here? She's not being rude. She's not criticizing Jesus. She's saying, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And now that you're here, even now something can happen. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And he uses future tense, which I think is why she got confused. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. She's talking about what her Bible in Daniel chapter 12 talks about, the very end resurrection, right? Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." Remember in John's gospel, there's 7 of these I am something statements, right? He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." So, get what's going on here. Martha is thinking about an event that was prophesied to happen in the future, the final resurrection. She's thinking about a time and an event. And when she says that to Jesus, Jesus says, that's not just an event, it's a who. I am the resurrection, and I am life. And not just any life, he's the life, right? He's going to say this again in John 14:6. I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, right? I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. It'll almost be like they're just sleeping, right? They're not really dead. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? I'm going to ask you that question. Do you believe that? Apparently, believing that is the most important thing about your faith. Because here's the deal. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15. I think I put it in your notes somewhere. In 1 Corinthians 15, he describes the resurrection of Christ and our resurrection. And he talks about how that's the pinnacle. The resurrection of Jesus is the pinnacle of our faith. Without the resurrection, we're worshiping a dead carpenter's son, right? So the resurrection is a huge part of our faith. He says, everyone who believes in me shall never die. So here's the deal. I went to a funeral recently. I went to Morgan's funeral. And I sat through that and I listened to all these stories. And, if you knew Morgan Smith, he's a great guy. He's hilarious. One of the funniest people in the world. He could have done stand-up and he'd have been top of the charts, man. He was awesome. And I was listening to all these stories, and I was just thinking about how, because Morgan got really, really serious about his faith over the last few years, and is actually a big encouragement to others too. But at that funeral, because I knew about his faith, I wasn't even thinking about him being dead. And I started thinking about that. Like, isn't it weird that us Christians can sit in a place like this and we should be absolutely distraught except for the truth that we believe, which means the body up there in the casket is not him. That he didn't die. That body he was in died. But he didn't die because he has faith in Christ. I mean, I kind of feel like I'm preaching here. Wake up. You see how the goodness of the good news. We don't die. We don't. You could you could refer to it like Jesus did, and the New Testament authors, the apostles did too. They just talked about it as someone falling asleep. They don't say they died because they didn't. Their body just died. So he says, do you believe this? And she said to him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Which seems weird to use future tense when he's standing in front of you. Isn't that strange? I believe you're the Messiah who is coming into the world. He's already in the world. She's quoting Psalm 118. Blessed is he who is coming in the name of the Lord. Right? So she's wrapping all that up in her statement. I believe you are the one. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to meet him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, or all the way into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met with him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, that's what they're there to do, they would do this, by the way, for a 7-day period. You would mourn with the family in their home for 7 days. So this is day 4 of the week-long thing. So they're consoling her. They saw Mary rise quickly and go out, so they followed her, supposing that she was going to go to the tomb to weep there. Now, catch this. Can you think of another story where some women are going to run out to a tomb and people are going to follow them there? Yeah, John chapter 20. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. Mary likes to be at Jesus' feet, apparently. Saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So apparently she's got enough faith to know that if Jesus had been there, wouldn't be in this situation. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Does that not seem strange? Now, let me tell you why that should seem strange to us. Does Jesus know what he's about to do? Does he already have a plan of what he's going to do here? Yeah. You know, if I had went to Morgan's funeral the other day, and I had the ability to raise the dead, and I walked in and saw people being emotional, this is probably because I'm not all that compassionate a person, but I wouldn't have wept with them. I'd have been standing there with a grin on my face like, oh, y'all ain't got no idea what I'm fixing to do. I ain't crying. I know what I'm about to do, right? Isn't it weird that Jesus, who knows what he's about to do, he knows he's about to solve this whole problem by raising the dead in front of God and everybody, right? But he's still moved, and he's troubled. It's almost as if he cares about how we feel. And apparently, he feels with us. Now go find me another religion where their God does that. You won't find it. You will not find Allah of the Islam faith doing anything like that. You won't find Buddha doing that. You're not going to find any other religion where the God of the universe cries because you're crying. But our God does. That's really good for me. Because you ever had times where whether you're really sad about something, or maybe you're really angry about something, or maybe you're just really confused. And you know, because you know who God is, you can bring that to God and he's not offended by it. Right? And there have been times where I've taken, whether it was whatever emotion it was, and I've put that before God, and I've said, God, I don't trust my heart. You told me in your word, the heart's deceitful. I'm not trusting my heart, but I got these feelings. Here they are. What do I do with this? And I know that my Heavenly Father is a Father, and he's a loving Father. His steadfast love endures forever. He's got plenty of it. He will love me through whatever it is I'm feeling, and apparently, in this story, he feels it with me. Isn't that interesting? He feels it with us. He's deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? Like he didn't know. They said to him, Lord, come and see. Come and see. That was in chapter 1. Except people were bringing them to Jesus. Come and see Jesus. Now Jesus is saying, where's the tomb? Come and see. And Jesus wept. Jesus stood there and took the time to cry with people. Does that not do something for you? It does for me. Because life hurts. There are times, even with all the faith that we have, it still hurts. And Jesus apparently knows every bit of that. And he will take time out of his busy resurrection schedule to stand there with hurting people and weep with them. This is one of the reasons why I choose to keep following Jesus. Because of stories like this. And by the way, John 11:35 is the shortest and most memorized verse in the whole Bible. Jesus wept. It's an easy one. But there's so much packed into those two words, isn't there? So the Jews said, see how he loved him. He loved Lazarus so much that he's standing there weeping with everybody. The healer is standing there weeping with everybody. And he's so moved visibly that the people standing around, some of which don't believe in him, notice and say, that guy really loves the dead guy. Look at how he's moved in this situation. But there's always, some Baptist deacons standing around or something. Just kidding. Some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man also have kept this man from dying? Like, why are we standing around watching this guy cry? He's a healer. He should have done something about this. And now we're in this situation. So there's two groups in this crowd, isn't there? There's a group that's taking note of what's going on and taking it serious. There's another group that's being critical. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave. It was a carved out tomb. Is that going to come up again in the story? Yeah. Carved out tomb. And a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, reject the stone. Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, and I'm going to read this in the King James, by now he stinketh. Isn't that what the King James says? Some of y'all are reading King James, I know. By this time there will be an odor. He's been dead 4 days, right? Now, Martha, who just had a bunch of faith that even now you can do something. When he starts to do something, she has a little bit of doubt. Like, wait a minute. Can't you kind of do this without having to open the tomb? This is going to smell bad. Martha, she's the person who's busy in her home, so she's probably like a neat freak. She's thinking about the smell, right? Take away the stone. Okay? Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. That's the line straight out of Psalm 118. I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they'll believe that I'm really talking to you and that you're really going to do what I'm about to ask. So apparently there's times where Jesus prays out loud to teach people something, right? And that's kind of a Trinity conundrum that we kind of go through. Like, okay, if the Son and the Father are both God, then why does one have to talk to the other, you know? And I would just say, he's God, you're not going to figure it all out, right? But apparently he does this so that the people standing there will see it, right? Thank you that you've heard me. When he had said these things, he cried out in a loud voice. He called upon the Lord in his distress. He'd just been standing there weeping and deeply moved and greatly troubled, distressed. And he calls on the Lord out of his distress, Psalm 118. Lazarus, come out. Hey, guy who's named God Helps, come out. And the man who had died came out, and his hands and feet are bound. He's bound up. He needs to be set free with linen strips. And by the way that they would bury people in the Jewish world was not like they did in Egypt. Okay, in Egypt they would wrap people up, but it was more intricate and a lot tighter. And they would embalm you in Egypt. The Egyptians would embalm. They kind of came up with that whole thing. The Jews didn't do that. They just wrapped you up with a bunch of spices and stuff that would kind of cover the smell for a little while. They'd wrap you up in that, put you in a tomb, and then you would decompose for at least a year, and then they would come back and get your bones and put them in a box. It was called an ossuary. I'm going to show you a picture of one in a minute. And then that would be put into a family tomb, and it would be alongside other boxes of your family members, and that was like the graveyard, right? So a little bit different practice, but he's bound up, his head's wrapped in a cloth. This is the same language described of Jesus' grave clothes, by the way, in John 20. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Psalm 118 began with the psalmist saying he's in distress. He calls out to the Lord. It's written from the Messiah's point of view. And he sets you free, right? Here, Jesus tells him to come out of the grave. He comes out all bound up, which you kind of have to wonder what that scene looked like, right? A guy who's been dead 4 days comes out of a tomb on his own. They didn't carry him out, right? I don't know if he's like hopping. He's tied up, you know, or if he's kind of shimmying around. I don't know. Anyway, and he says, set him free. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. This was the final straw for them. We've seen him do some stuff that kind of looks like magic tricks other people try to fool us with, but they kind of looked real and we kind of couldn't deny them. But when we saw a guy who we know has been dead 4 days, we've been here 4 days. We know he's dead. And we saw him come hobbling out of the tomb by himself. That did it for us. So some of the Jews believed, but some of them are tattletales. And they went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. You're supposed to get that as negative. They went to tell on Jesus. hey, he did another one of those signs again. So, now the narrative is going to shift gears to a completely different scene. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council, that's the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, and said, what are we going to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, now just pause there. Here's what they just said. If we let him go on like this, helping people, raising people from the dead, giving blind people sight, telling people who can't walk that they can walk now, if we just let him go on doing this kind of stuff, everyone's going to believe in him. Were they right? Pretty close. Maybe not every single person, but a bunch of people believe in him. And the Romans will come, and they will take away both our place and our nation. So here's the problem, okay? The Pharisees don't hate Jesus because he's helping people. They hate Jesus because he's gaining more influence than they have. And they have all the influence right now, especially the Pharisees. The Pharisees are in charge of all the synagogues in Israel. The Sadducees are in charge of the temple, but even the Pharisees have a say-so in that too. The Sanhedrin was half Sadducees, half Pharisees, right? So they've got all this power, they've got all this influence, and if you're a Pharisee or a Sadducee, you are filthy rich. And now this, carpenter boy from Taylor County, aka Nazareth, shows up on the scene, and everybody's believing in him, and he's saying bad stuff about us. We can't let him go on like this. Do you see what their real problem is? We're afraid we're going to lose our place, our position, and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand. Now listen to what he says here. That it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Hey guys, I got a great idea. You bunch of dummies. That's what he basically says. I got a great idea. Isn't it better for one guy to die than for the Romans to come kill us all? Shouldn't one guy die for everybody? And John is going to be like, can you believe what he just said? Watch this. Oh, hold on. We'll get that in a minute. But one of them, Caiaphas, he did not say this on his own accord. The narrator, John, says, can you believe what he just said? That one man should die for everyone. The gospel, right? But being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. He's saying this guy made a prophecy right then and didn't even realize it. Because Caiaphas is no fan of Jesus. He thinks this is a good idea. We should kill him. Right? And not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Who's that? The Gentiles. In chapter 12, there's a little paragraph, and it says a bunch of Greeks came to the disciples, and they want to meet Jesus. This is what it's about, right? So from that day on, they made plans to put Jesus to death. Why'd they have to make plans? Because they're not allowed to kill anybody without Roman approval, and Rome has to be the one that executes it. They can't do it themselves. Now, they could sneak around and do it, but Jesus is way too popular. If he was just some regular guy with no following, they could sneak, at night or something and go behind the temple and kill him and bury him, and nobody would know. But Jesus is a big deal. Everybody would know something happened, and they would all blame the Pharisees, right? Now, I'll show you something, a little historical fact. This Caiaphas guy, for a long time, even though we have other historical writings, there's a historian named Josephus in the 1st century who wrote down the Jewish history, and he mentions Caiaphas and talks about him. Many other documents have that. But even with all that, some people doubted whether Caiaphas was ever a real person, right? Until in 1990, they were trying to build a water park in an ancient area of Jerusalem, outside Jerusalem. So, Jerusalem is an ancient city, right? I mean, you would think, maybe let's not put a water park. There's some ancient stuff here. Let's not just go digging around. But that's what they did. They start digging around to build this water park. And one of the big, tractors fell in, like the ground just opened up and the tractor started falling in. And it was a family tomb. And there were 12 different boxes in there. And one of them had Caiaphas in it, because his name's on the side of the box. Joseph Caiaphas. And that's the one talked about in the New Testament. So in that box was the bones of a man who was about, based on testing, at least 60 years old. And there were some bones of his family members. A lot of times they would combine them into one box. So I think there was about 6 different people. Their bones were in this box, and Caiaphas is one of them. And his name is on it in 2 places, on 2 sides of the box. So for sure, John knows what he's talking about, because we can dig it up and look at it, right? Now Jesus therefore, because now they've decided to make plans to kill him again, Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples. He's going to stay there until Passover begins. And that's going to be the next few verses. So we're not finishing chapter 11 tonight, because it changes gears in the next verse to start talking about Passover coming up. So Jesus withdraws from Jerusalem because they want to kill him, and now they're making serious plans to. And he knows when you raise a guy from the dead, that for sure is going to make them want to kill you, because now nobody can argue with them about the identity of Christ, right? You can raise a dead guy, you're the real deal. So now he's going to go up north to this town called Ephraim, and he's going to hang out there. Now, with all that said, I know that was a fire hydrant of information. What does the story of Lazarus mean for us today? Okay, and none of this is about to be new information, but we need to hear this repeatedly. 1 Corinthians 15 says this: "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, and he's the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep." It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? He's the firstfruits. Well, if you have firstfruits, that must mean there's some second and third and fourth and fifth fruits, right? Because if there's not more after the first, you would just say fruit. There's first fruits. So apparently, Christ's resurrection is the beginning of something for another group. The first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, have died. "For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, because we all sin," right? Paul says this in Romans, all die because all sin. "Also in Christ shall all be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, he was first. Then at his coming, those who belong to Christ." Now, what does this mean for us? The Lazarus story was a preview. The Lazarus story is the last sign that Jesus does before he does his own resurrection at the end of John's gospel. That was proof. The Lazarus story is proof that his own resurrection was going to happen, and he had the power to do it himself. Jesus did not have to call out for someone to take away his stone. He did it himself. And because in him was life, and that life is the light of men, Jesus raised himself from the dead, proving that he is the Son of God. What does that mean for us? Well, it means that Jesus is going to do for us something even greater than he did for Lazarus. Why is it greater? Because Lazarus died again. Can you imagine? You died, you're hanging out with Abraham, right? In the afterlife. You're 4 days into this thing, probably having a good old time. And then you hear, Lazarus, come back. I've often wondered how that whole thing went down. I wondered if there was any moment of delay there where Lazarus had to be like, really? But if I go back, that means I got to die again. Remember, he died sick. It wasn't a pleasant death. It wasn't like he fell off a cliff and that was it. He died a slow death of an illness. And then he got called back. But then he died again. But nobody in here, if you're a follower of Jesus, will face a second death. We will die, our bodies will die one time. And then that next body we get will never die again. So why does this Lazarus story matter for us? I think we find the meaning in Lazarus' name. God helps. And how does he help us? He saves us from our sin. He saves us from the power of the enemy over us by giving us his Holy Spirit. And the Spirit that is in us is greater than he who is in the world. Amen? So he gives us that. He purified us by dying on the cross and paying for our sin. So we're pure, which means we're declared righteous. And on top of all that, he's going to raise us from the dead one day. That's why we need to read the Lazarus story. Because one day he's going to come back and he's going to come through the clouds up there. And if we're still alive, we're going to get called up to meet him in the air. The people who have died before us will rise first. He will say to everyone, come out. And we will be given a brand new body that won't get sick, it won't get cancer, and it won't be subject to sin. That's the good news. That's why we need to read stories like this over and over and over again. And out of all that we just heard, our proper response should be Psalm 118. Praise Yahweh our God, for his steadfast love endures forever. It never runs out. It's good news, isn't it? It's good news. Next week, here's your homework. We're going to finish up chapter 11. It's just a few verses. And then we'll do the first 26 verses of chapter 12. This will cover the anointing of Jesus, where Mary is going to anoint him. That's a Messiah thing, by the way. We'll talk about it next week. Then the triumphal entry will happen, where they're going to be quoting from Psalm 118 as Jesus is coming into town. And obviously there's going to be some Jews who don't like it. Shocking, right? So we're going to cover that next time. So read that passage a few times between now and then, and we'll see what we can learn next week.